Hello, and welcome to this presentation from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood to the Counseling Office, using earned secure attachment to impact emotional regulation in trauma survivors. My name is Dr. Anita Knight-Coonley, and my PhD is in counselor ed and supervision, and I also have a background in attachment as an adult attachment interview coder, and am the author of The Mr. Rogers Effect. And I am here with my stellar colleague, Dr. Lisa Compton, who is an expert on trauma, and she is often affectionately called Trauma Mama. And she's also the author of Preparing for Trauma Work in Clinical Mental Health, the newly released book. And so we're here to talk with you about this connection between trauma and attachment and Mr. Rogers.
Yes, so let's share what we're going to go over with you in this next hour. We are going to start with a discussion about post traumatic recovery pathway. And from there, we're going to lead on to some teaching about attachment, some teaching about trauma, and also how the two of those interact. And then we'll move on to a discussion about emotional regulation. So from there, we'll move more into our segment on treatment. So that will include lessons from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Safe Haven lessons, as well as a specific application for counselors towards the end of our webinar.
Thank you, Lisa. And just to give you a visual overview of what Dr. Compton just talked about, we have a colleague, Dr. Justin Sylvie, who likes to say, life is like a Venn diagram because so many things in life overlap. So here we're looking at the specific recovery pathway, recovering from post-traumatic stress, by looking at emotional intelligence as a resource, as well as attachment as resources on the journey to recovery. And we're using Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Safe Haven principles from his work as a model. So as you may have noticed in the program, and as we've discussed, the constructs we're looking at are emotional intelligence, and the top of the hierarchy in emotional intelligence is emotion regulation, as well as attachment, and how these constructs overlap and influence healing and post-traumatic recovery, particularly for survivors of developmental trauma, people who've experienced what attachment researchers call attachment injuries, what Jim McCullough, a depression researcher, calls psychological insults, what some people might call low-grade trauma. Different names for the same thing here, but there is a type of attachment that's not often discussed called earned secure attachment. It's a subtype of secure. And people can have this particular attachment style when they haven't had a history of real warm, responsive interactions with their caregivers. Maybe they experienced instrumental care, but somehow they were able to work through that, make sense of their history, and still develop secure tendencies and value relationships. And we're going to look at how moving in this direction can help with really increasing emotion regulation for survivors. And we will, of course, use as an example or an emotionally intelligent attachment figure, Mr. Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, who interestingly had many things in common with a famous psychologist of the same surname, Dr. Carl Rogers. So one of the first things we want to explore is the idea of attachment and how it relates to emotion regulation. The circle of security is a great visual representation of this. And if you're not familiar with the circle of security, this particular diagram is used with permission from the Hawkins and colleagues text, Research-Based Counseling Skills. And Dr. Bob Marvin is a creator of the circle of security. And Bob Marvin, if you think about the sort of genealogy, if you will, of attachment researchers, you can think of John Bowlby as the father of attachment, then Mary Ainsworth as his research partner, who met him at the Tavistock Clinic in London, where they ran the strange situation experiments together. And then Mary Ainsworth wound up landing at the University of Virginia, where Dr. Bob Marvin was her assistant and worked with her for over 50 years. And they founded the Ainsworth Attachment Clinic in Charlottesville, Virginia, just down the road from us. And so Dr. Marvin, in order to work with the families that he works with, developed this visual of the circle of security. And so on one end, you see the hands. These hands represent, you could also think of them as open arms, representing the secure base and the safe haven of an attachment figure. And so a child can launch from that secure base out to explore. And when they go out to explore, they need their attachment figure to watch over them, help them, enjoy with them, and take delight in them. But at some point, they will experience a stressor. Um, they could experience trauma. They could experience something that is considered a threat to the attachment system. So, as they experience threat, the attachment system comes on, and then their exploration system shuts off, and they need to go find that safety, and they're driven to go back to their safe haven and secure base. And so that we refer to as being on the bottom side of the circle. And when they're on the bottom of the circle, there's really a need to be welcomed by the attachment figure, to feel protected and comforted by the attachment figure, to know that the attachment figure is delighting in them. And we notice that one is the same on the top and bottom of the circle, as well as, and I always think this last one is very interesting because as counselors, we do a lot of this, helping people organize their feelings and make sense of their feelings. Um, so these are the needs that an individual has at the bottom side of the circle. And although we talk about children often with attachment, we know that there's also adult attachment relationships. And although the hands may be represented by a spouse or partner, or even a dear friend or family member, um, the needs are very similar still yet. And so, if you think about emotion regulation, when a child has a responsive caregiver and they can go back when they're on the bottom side of the circle and experience safety and security, then they're able to shut down that attachment system, turn off exploration, and go out and interact. But when the attachment figure could potentially be the source of trauma, maybe they have trouble regulating their temper, maybe they're abusive, then there can be problems with emotion regulation. What is the child to do when the person that is supposed to provide them comfort is also a threat? And so we'll talk more about this as we continue on, but this gives you an idea of how our innate attachment system is designed to help regulate us. And those behaviors on the bottom side of the circle, going to the safe haven secure base, seeking proximity or closeness, are designed as regulatory functions to help us regulate uh, our emotions. Um, Now, to give you one more example with adults, at the International Attachment Conference in New York City several years ago, Dr. James Cohn, a researcher of the University of Virginia, was speaking about a recent study he had done. And he was studying this idea that attachment can serve a regulatory function. And he had people come in to his clinic to uh, receive a shock. And while they came in, they were in one of three conditions. They were either holding the hands of their spouse, or they were holding the hand of a stranger, or they were not holding anyone's hand. And in this situation, he found that those that were holding someone's hand actually experienced attenuation of the neural threat response. In other words, their brains actually registered less pain than those that were not holding someone's hand. And even more interesting, they used the dyadic adjustment scale, the DAS, to rate marital quality. And those with higher marital quality experienced more of a regulatory function when it came to hand holding. And so we can see visually when we look at neuroimaging that something is happening in the brain with attachment, relationships, and support that can help with the regulation of pain and the regulation of emotion.
Yes. So, how does that tie into trauma? Well, attachment and trauma can tie together in multiple ways. First, we can have trauma occur within the context of an attachment relationship. So, like Anita was talking about, ideally, a secure attachment base would involve caregivers that are loving and protecting the children. But what can happen, unfortunately, is that abuse can occur. And so you can have the perpetrator of abuse actually be the person that is supposed to be providing the care. So that is one example of how trauma can impact attachment and vice versa. It doesn't necessarily have to be caregivers as well. So it could be that there was a trusted adult or someone in someone's life that was supposed to be a person that was trustworthy and safe, but instead there could have been some infraction and abuse there. And so that can create some very significant pain and traumatic experiences. Also, just an attachment deficit itself can be a traumatic experience. So, research has shown that children that experience neglect can have just as strong post traumatic stress reactions as children that experience blatant abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and emotional abuse. So, we know that neglect and other attachment injuries can cause significant trauma reactions as well. Now, the flip side of this is true that strong attachment relationships can actually buffer post traumatic reactions. So, if somebody is experiencing trauma outside of that attachment relationship, so maybe abuse from someone else, or even a natural disaster, or some type of significant traumatic event, but they have had a secure trauma base that can moderate the symptoms. So it can work both ways that trauma can be impacted negatively by attachment, and it can also be impacted in a positive way by secure attachment. So we know that this secure base can help regulate emotional regulation. So if you think back to the circle that Anita was sharing, and at the top where there's secure attachment, and the children are able then from that secure base to go out and explore the world. They're not focused on their survival needs because those are being met by their caregivers. So those children tend to be very emotionally regulated. They have taken the comforting of their caregivers, and then they can begin to internalize it and self soothe and regulate. But then we see towards the bottom of the circle, those children that do not have secure attachment are much more focused on getting those attachment needs met. So, in some ways, if you think about it like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when the bottom of the pyramid, the survival, the basic needs are met, then we can move up the pyramid towards self actualization. But when they are not met, that is our top priority. And we are uniquely designed to function in a way that prioritizes our survival. So, children that have these attachment deficits have to focus on seeking out that proximity seeking, seeking out ways that they can fill that void. And this can create significant distress and dysregulation emotionally because these children are much more vulnerable. They don't have the caregiver with the open arms looking out and protecting them, and they also haven't been able to internalize that self-soothing response. So that creates again more propensity for emotional dysregulation.
And Lisa, I really appreciate the way you gave the two visuals here to represent what is happening physiologically and emotionally within the individual. So there's the circle of security, where being on the bottom side of the circle is similar to being on the low end of Maslow's hierarchy. And I think that's really interesting to think about it that way, because if you look at the adult attachment interview, when a person has what we call preoccupied attachment style, some people call it ambivalent, right? But there's a sense of being preoccupied. And it makes sense if you're worried about safety and survival that you would be preoccupied with those things and not able to be present and attentive to the needs of others. And oftentimes, a child winds up having the same attachment style as their parent. It doesn't have to be that way. And of course, the good news is people can move towards a more secure style, but we tend to see those patterns develop. So that preoccupied style is pretty well named there.
Yeah, so let's take an example then and see how this plays out. We're going to use a teenage boy named Kyle. And I know that this image on the screen is somewhat triggering, and it's meant to be because we're going to talk about a traumatic situation. So let's pretend that Kyle is walking through a park and eating a sandwich that he just got, a nice roast beef and cheese sandwich, and enjoying a lovely spring day. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, an huge alligator approaches him nearby the playground. Now, Kyle does not have time to think in a way that is going to be slow and reasoning, well, what should I do? No, he needs to instinctually do something to survive. So immediately, Kyle's body and brain are going to go into survival mode, and the most common is this fight flight response. There are some other responses that we'll talk about, but for this scenario, let's take the fight flight response. So what happens in Kyle's brain is that an alarm will go off, and that mechanism is called the amygdala. And the amygdala sounds the alarm and lets Kyle's body know, hey, we are going into survival mode. So there are certain physiological changes that are going to happen immediately in Kyle. Kyle's heart rate is going to start to be even faster so that more blood can go to his extremities so that he can be able to run very quickly. His breathing is going to be shallowed so that the oxygen intake can be increased. And then certain things that are not necessary for immediate survival, such as digestion of that sandwich that he's eating, as well as the frontal cortex, where there's logic and reasoning and communication, that is going to temporarily be offline for Kyle at the moment while he tries to get away from this alligator. Now, thankfully, Kyle is a very fast runner and maybe even runs in a zigzag pattern or whatever we're recommended to do. So he starts getting away from this alligator. And the alligator just ate, so he's a little slower than most alligators. But as Kyle's running top speed, he sees his older brother pull up alongside of the park. He jumps in the car and pulls off. And Kyle is safe now from the alligator. So what happens is, in a physiological way, he will now enter something that we call rest and digest. So it's a reversal of that fight flight response. And so his frontal cortex is going to go back online, and Kyle is going to be able to now communicate and go through logic and reasoning. And slowly but surely, he is even going to be able to digest some of that sandwich that was in his belly, but he is probably going to have quite an upset stomach of having some food in there while all this was going on. So, if this were a one time occurrence, it would probably create some flashbacks for Kyle. He may have some nightmares about alligators in his sleep, and he also may be pretty hesitant to go back to that same playground. However, this one time event probably will not impact him long term in many physiological ways. But let's think about this. What if this were complex trauma? What if every day Kyle was walking to school and had to pass this park, and every day he got chased by the alligator? But let's think about that, because that would mean that Kyle's system is being bathed with these neurotransmitters and hormones that were meant for this once in a blue moon fight flight response. But over time, they can be toxic to his organs and create significant fatigue, as well as increasing his fears, his hypervigilance, and his startle response, and all of these other symptoms, and have much more intrusive thoughts and avoidance. All of these are pretty characteristics of post traumatic stress injury. Now, let's take it even a step further. Let's say that there's some developmental trauma in that maybe Kyle experienced abuse at the hands of his parents or loved ones, and had some physical and mental abuse over a long period of time. So we can see that this complex and developmental trauma, it can cause some significant changes in brain chemistry to Kyle and have some pretty significant outcomes in terms of distress and impairment and functioning. However, the really good news is that research is showing us now that neuroplasticity, which means the brain is able to heal and change, and even those significant changes to brain circuitry can be reversed. So that's really good news for trauma survivors, and it's great news for us as counselors because it gives some significant legitimacy to our healing and recovery process.
Yes, thank you for sharing that, Lisa. We know that even going way back to Yalom's therapeutic factors, that the installation of hope is a powerful therapeutic factor. And that hope of neuroplasticity, knowing that even if someone is exposed to chronic developmental trauma, that their brain can change, things can be rewired, things can heal, and they can move towards a more regulated state and move towards a more earned, secure style of attachment.
Yes, so it's very good news. And it's something that we want to keep in mind as we are counseling clients, because this state between emotional dysregulation and regulation is a very important concept. So, whether our clients have trauma histories or attachment deficits or both, this is something that is going to significantly impact regulation, and we want to make sure that we help them regulate in session, especially. We want to make sure that our counseling experience is not re traumatizing. So it's important to recognize the fight, flight, and also freeze responses. Even when we are in the middle of counseling, because just exposure to these painful memories can cause emotional dysregulation. So let's look at this slide and see what does this look like. So that center line there represents equilibrium. So this is the in-between stage, the ideal stage that we want to maintain as much as possible. So when we go up on the graph, that's hyperarousal, and so that's our fight flight, just like Kyle experienced with the alligator. And this is a state where think of it as an engine that's revved up, that we can be very anxious and overreactive and hypervigilant, and there's significant distress. We can also see some impulsivity in terms of behaviors as well. So that's the hyperarousal. And then the bottom of the screen is the hypoarousal, which is a just a severe response, but opposite in terms of symptomology. So here we can see that people shut down, they go numb, there's some dissociation, some freezing. It might be viewed as lack of motivation for anything, but really it's not lack of motivation. It's another way that the system avoids the pain and tries to maintain that survival. So these responses happen even when there's not actual danger present, but just the triggers of trauma memory and attachment deficits alone can send people into one of these extreme responses. Now, our goal is to help the client regulate and stay at equilibrium, and that middle phase is also known as the window of tolerance. Now, there is going to be some movement back and forth between hyper and hypoarousal, because part of what we do is often discuss some traumatic experiences. So it's not that we need to keep perfect equilibrium, but we want to observe clients as they move in and out of hyper and hypoarousal, and help them over time be able to self regulate, to have good awareness to look at these emotional dysregulated states, and utilize coping skills and grounding exercises so that they are able to get back to a more regulated state.
Yes. And as we think about how to help clients stay in that window of tolerance and how to be regulated, and what we can do in session to help them feel safe, one great example comes to mind, and that is Mr. Fred Rogers. He used many different strategies or psychological principles to help children feel safe. And that was no accident. He was mentored by Dr. Margaret McFarland at the University of Pittsburgh in the Child Development Center. And she worked together with some of the greatest of that time, Benjamin Spock and Eric Erickson. So, developmental psychologists who um, really were influential in shaping our understanding of how children grow and develop across time and across the lifespan, actually. And Mr. Rogers was supervised by Dr. McFarland when he was taking a counseling class when he went to seminary on his lunch breaks. And he enjoyed her mentoring so much that it became a lifelong process for the remainder of her life. She met with him on a regular basis and they consulted and talked about how to um, use the principles of child development to reach children. And he used these psychological principles throughout his career. and he recorded and took notes during their sessions. And so the Mr. Rogers effect really unpacks 7 key psychological principles that he used that were most salient throughout his work. But here we're focusing on safe haven lessons that he used specifically to help children feel safe and secure so that they could shut down their attachment system and really go out and be curious about their environments and interact. So one of those is expression of care. He started with an invitation to be neighbors. It was gentle, it was unforced, it was graceful, but there was a communication of valuing. I think it's about 5 different times within that song that he asks, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? And so it's very clear. And when you look at the characteristics in the adult attachment interview of a secure attachment style or earned secure attachment style, one is highly valuing relationships. And so he definitely made it clear that you are highly valued. Next is he was very intentional about transitions. When you think about Mr. Rogers, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Lisa, how about you? When you think about it, what comes to mind for you?
I think that it's probably a combination of his fuzzy sweaters and his sweet songs.
Oh, his sweet songs and fuzzy sweaters. It's really interesting that you say that because at the beginning of every episode, he changed from his blazer into one of his fuzzy sweaters and sang one of his sweet songs. That was, sort of his signature hallmark thing that he did. Every episode, you could count on him putting on a sweater and changing his shoes and asking you, singing to you, won't you be my neighbor? So he did these transitions so well and children could predict and know what was coming, know what to expect, and feel safe. Uh, and that also helped build cohesion with those rituals. Now, we also know from the literature that chronic developmental trauma can impact our perception of safety. And so, as Lisa shared earlier with the case, if that young man was encountering um, this traumatic event every single day where he was fearing for his safety, then that could impact his overall perception of safety. And even when there is no threat present, he may still feel hypervigilant, on edge, looking for the possibility of threat in order to maintain that safety. And so for children who have experienced trauma, these transitions and this intentional work to help kids feel safe can be even more powerful. The third thing that Mr. Rogers did is he let children know that feelings were mentionable and manageable. This is something he learned from Dr. McFarland, who used to say that whatever is human is mentionable and whatever's mentionable is manageable. And he shortened that to feelings are mentionable and manageable. But he truly believed that if we could help children to be able to mention and talk about their feelings and manage them in ways that don't hurt themselves or anyone else, that we could make the world a safer place for the children of tomorrow so people could regulate their anger in appropriate ways. And he did this himself, and he talked about it often in his programming. He was a pianist, and so often when he was feeling angry, he would pound out his feelings on the piano. He might play low notes. Sometimes he mentioned he would use clay and pound out the Play-Doh. He also talked about how children could run. Um, he wrote a song inspired by a little boy who asked him, "What do you do with the mad that you feel?" And in the song, he said, "When you feel so mad, you can bite. When the whole wide world feels oh so wrong and nothing you do feels very right. Do you round up friends for a game of tag? Do you pound some clay or some dough?" At the end of the song, he says, "It's good to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong. Do something else instead and think this song." And he wanted kids to know about that feeling of self-control, which is part of emotion regulation. And what's interesting is now there is a program that is a descendant of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. Have you heard of that one? It's an animated cartoon, so it's geared towards preschool age children. But Mr. Rogers used to have the little puppet Daniel Tiger, and they say really that his wife mentioned that represents really who Fred was, kind of in his vulnerable state, and so they created an animated program based on Daniel Tiger. He sings the song, he changes into a sweater, he takes the trolley to the land of make believe. So it's sort of the next generation of Mr. Rogers. But on that program, they sing a song about anger as well, and say when you feel so mad that you could roar, you take a deep breath and count to four. 1, 2, 3, 4. And very simple song, but really profound in terms of teaching children emotion regulation in just a few lines, and even using the vocal intonations to model that. So that programming was very powerful, and that concept of mentionable and manageable. Many of us may not have grown up with those messages. You may have heard things like, put a smile on your face, turn that frown upside down, don't complain, or don't cry, or I'll give you something to cry about. Not very empathic messages there. But he really wanted kids to know that it was important that they could share their feelings and work through them. And he was very empathic. There was a sense that your thoughts and feelings would be understood and that they really mattered to him. And as counselors, we can demonstrate that empathy as well. He once stopped production because someone told a puppet not to cry. And he said, you're never, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically, you're never to tell a child, a puppet, adult, or anyone not to cry. When people say don't cry, all it means is that they're uncomfortable with the tears. It'd be better to say, go ahead and cry. I'm here to be with you. And so that's really empathy in a nutshell. So another aspect of an attachment figure is often it's represented by someone who's considered older and wiser. And so to children, Mr. Rogers was an older and wiser television neighbor, and to parents, he was an ally, but he was an expert on child development that could help and coach them along. And another powerful safe haven lesson is acceptance. Whenever you listen to Mr. Rogers' songs, you just hear this theme of acceptance. Lisa mentioned thinking about his sweet songs. I think of the song I heard the other day. The very same people who are bad sometimes are the very same people who are good sometimes. Sometimes you get wet and your parents get upset. There's just this very accepting tone that feelings are temporary and that we all can have unpleasant feelings, but the very same people who are mad sometimes are glad sometimes, so those emotions will change. And one of my favorite things, a message he got from his grandfather McFeely, who's named after his grandpa was named Fred McFeely, and his name was Fred McFeely Rogers. And he named the Speedy Delivery Man, Mr. McFeely, after his grandpa. But his grandpa used to tell him, Freddie, you've made today a special day just by your being you. There's no one in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are. And then he spent over 30 years and over 800 television programs sharing that same message with television neighbors all over the US. And so he had a way of helping children feel valued, helping them feel safe, accepted, that someone was on their side, someone was empathic, someone older and wiser was watching out for them, that their feelings could be talked about and understood. He talked about things like divorce and even death, and that transitions. He made them very solid, helped kids know what to expect and know that they were cared for. um, Transitional object, he was really good with transitions. As Lisa mentioned earlier, we think of his fuzzy sweaters when we think of transitions. If you ever watched Peanuts, maybe you think of Linus's security blanket. uh, Whenever you think about Linus, I mean, he had this blanket with him as a representation of that sense of security. And a lot of times we use these to help children regulate. It represents the maternal nurturing when the parent is not there. And the child is eventually able to hopefully internalize that and begin to self regulate. And sometimes, even in counseling, we'll use different transitional objects to represent the progress, the comfort, the organized feelings or regulation a client has accomplished throughout counseling. So, for example, in addictions work, sometimes we'll use something like a token. I worked as a substance abuse counselor at a residential facility, and when people graduated, they would get a certificate that they could keep with them. Uh, One of the things that Lisa mentioned is, sometimes we use the stones or a pretty rock that represents the idea that they are a precious jewel, or that the Lord has given them, for counseling from a Christian worldview, a white stone with a new name on it. They may carry that white stone to represent their new identity. Okay, and another thing we wanted to talk more about was how these safe haven secure based concepts can be used by counselors in treatment. Dr. Compton, do you want to tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. Yeah. So there's multiple ways that we can apply the really seemingly simplistic messages of Fred Rogers to the complexity of human nature and emotions and relationships. And so when we take these and we apply them, we can look at multiple things, such as number one, expression of care. This goes hand in hand with compassion work, which is why most of us got into this field. It's to help people and help them to feel good about themselves and safe and secure. So this goes back to one of the terms that Anita mentioned earlier, is that earned secure attachment. So in many ways, we play the role of caregivers within the therapeutic alliance. And while it doesn't always mean that we fully make up for all attachment deficits that clients may bring in, we are modeling, though, a caring, nurturing relationship. And so we can help clients by helping them with transitions, and even by using our informed consent with helping them understand what is coming, what are the expectations, what is counseling going to look like, and including them in this collaborative relationship of building their own treatment planning and having voice and choice within our sessions. And then also, as Anita had mentioned, the mentionable and manageable, and just helping clients see that there is an expectation that we are going to talk about emotions, and because we are comfortable with emotions, they're part of who we are, and that the therapeutic room is a safe place to discuss those and process through their emotions. And again, obviously, empathy goes hand in hand with the compassion. And it's the difference between saying sympathy with, oh, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And instead, empathy will communicate, I see your pain and I'm walking through this recovery process with you. And I think it takes a lot of emotional regulation on our own part to be comfortable with people's pain. And that's something that Fred Rogers, I think, modeled so well, is being present and getting comfortable with negative emotions. Because otherwise, we can have a tendency to further defense mechanisms of suppression and avoidance. So, through our empathy and through creating that safe space where we can be empathetic and present with our clients, even when they're experiencing pain and discussing some really traumatic experiences, is very important. And then older and wiser, we're not always older or necessarily wiser than our clients, but instead it's providing support along that way. And not that we're functioning as, oh, we're the experts, we're here to tell you what you need to do, but instead that we are compassionate listeners, and providing hope that, hey, we have walked through this with other counselors, with other clients, and we believe that you will be able to meet your goals, and having hope for the journey is so important. And then finally, that unconditional positive regard and acceptance, similar to Dr. Carl Rogers, where we accept clients just where they're at. We may not agree with all of their behaviors or worldviews, but that we are going to give them that unconditional respect and join with them in a secure attachment, regardless of the ups and downs that they go through, while we journey together in that healing process.
Wonderful. It's really interesting to hear how we use so many of these safe haven concepts in our counseling sessions that Mr. Rogers used in his television programming. That's one of the reasons I like to call him children's television therapist, because he was so therapeutic. And I can see the session unfolding, starting with the expression of care. Hello, Jane. It's so good to see you today. I'm glad you made it in. And maybe even not in these COVID days, but if it's safe, maybe even starting with a handshake and specific transitions. Well, let's take a moment to recap what we talked about in our last session. You mentioned your takeaway was X, Y, and Z. And I wonder what is on your agenda for today that you'd like to gain from our session today. And then letting them know that they're able to talk about whatever's on their heart, even if it is displeasure with the counseling process and with us as their clinicians. And now, as Lisa mentioned, it takes a lot of regulation to stay present when people are um, disclosing perhaps trauma or even unpleasant feelings towards you. But I always encourage students and myself to remember our Q-tips. Right, Q-tip is an acronym for quit taking it personally, and it helps us to remember that if we can stick with that person through it and not get offended, then chances are we can make progress and we can connect and work through that. And then that empathy, connecting with our clients, walking alongside, as Lisa mentioned, leaning on our training to know, even though we may not literally be older and wiser, we are taking time to train and prepare. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about Dr. Compton's latest book, is it really focuses on preparing for trauma work and clinical mental health. And that preparation is something that Mr. Rogers did very well throughout his time with his mentor, Dr. McFarland. He took time to prepare for all of his sessions. He was very intentional about what he showed in his programming. And then acceptance, that unconditional positive regard that Dr. Compton mentioned. These things can be seen throughout our sessions.
Yeah, so just in the last few minutes here, I'd just like to highlight some of the counseling skills for emotion regulation, as we're now taking all that we learned from Mr. Rogers and applying them. So we've talked about the earn secure attachment and just how important that attunement is. And so as we maintain eye contact with our clients, as we pick up on their verbals and nonverbals, and as we stay very present, we had mentioned that that improves attachments. And again, we've talked about the discussion of emotions and having that be an expectation as clients are feeling comfortable. Of course, we don't force the discussion, but we do bring it up with our open-ended questions and exploring feelings to let them know that that's part of what we do in counseling. And modeling that emotional regulation. Sometimes it's very difficult to be emotionally regulated, especially in the trauma work we do, and hearing the horrific stories that can trigger our own countertransference. And so being able to do our own self-care and our own counseling outside of session so that we can manage that countertransference and not have our own stuff negatively leak into session and impact our clients is very important. So being able to model not an emotionally distant persona, but one that's emotionally engaged, but yet safe and regulated. And recognizing emotional triggers as well as relational triggers. So helping clients become more aware of attachment issues and how some of that may be occurring even in their adult relationships, and what some triggers are for their own emotional dysregulation is important. I love this one. Modeling rupture and repair is so important. There can be times when the therapeutic alliance um, gets entangled and gets difficult, and clients can be upset with us at different things, and we can make mistakes. And so, being able to model the rupture and repair process within our therapeutic relationship can provide some great skills for them as they take that out into their own personal lives. And then finally, working on grounding exercises and a return to equilibrium. So, Anita, do you want to wrap up as we conclude here?
Yes, thank you, Lisa, for all of those tools to keep in mind. And um, I just want to leave you with a couple concepts to contemplate here. Jude Cassidy, when she was at the International Attachment Conference, asked two powerful questions. And I'm just going to pose these to Lisa quickly. One, how do you feel, Lisa, when you feel secure?
Hmm. I feel safe and content.
Safe and content. And then how do you behave when you feel secure, that is safe and content?
I think that I'm more likely to engage with my environment and take some risks, and um, yeah, just more extroverted and more confident.
Yes, that sounds very much like that circle of security. Feeling safe and content, then able to go out and explore and engage, feeling extroverted. Um, Well, Dr. Cassidy, who is the editor of the Handbook of Attachment, she said that she keeps a statement on her wall that says, "Do what you would do if you felt secure." So that's kind of that priming for security, remembering what you would feel like and how you would behave if you felt secure, and then reminding yourself uh, to try to work from that secure place. And one way of priming for security is to think about those people who loved us into becoming, who loved us into being who we are today. And one of the things Mr. Rogers did every time he got a chance to share at a graduation ceremony or at an award ceremony is he invited participants to take 10 seconds to think about who loved them into becoming. And so we just like to invite you to take a short 10 seconds right now to think about those that loved you into being who you are today. Those individuals may be close by, they may be far away, or as Mr. Rogers liked to say, they may even be in heaven. But think of how happy they would be to know that you thought of them, that they made a difference in your journey. And perhaps thinking of them helps you to feel that sense of safety and contentment that Lisa mentioned. We thank you for coming to our presentation today. We pray and hope that it's been helpful to you. If you'd like to keep in touch with us, our emails are listed here. Lisa Com at regent.edu, A Coonley at regent.edu. You can also find us on social media. My Instagram handle is the.empathetic.counselor. And on Facebook, my name is Anita Coonley, Kuhnley.
Thank you very much for joining us and for the hard work that you do in keeping our clients in safe havens. And we wish you the best.